My name is Will Crowley. I'm your 2018 president of NEBA.
Well, thank you guys for being here today. We really appreciate it. Our speaker today is Eric Eggers, and how many of you remember him from his days on WFLA with Preston Scott? He was fabulous on there. I really enjoyed the balance that he brought to that program. He was very, very good on that, and I really miss him being there. Anyway, Eric now is a research director for the Government Accountability Institute. He works under famed investigative journalist Peter Schweizer. How many of you guys remember Peter? Absolutely. Well, Peter was heavily involved in research for national bestsellers Clinton Cash, Extortion, and Secret Empires. Let's see, Eric was the director of research for the #1 New York Times best-selling Clinton Cash graphic novel. Eric was also an associate producer for the Clinton Cash documentary and is a co-executive producer for an upcoming documentary on Google and Facebook, and that's going to be really interesting. He has also produced several Fox News specials which aired on the Sean Hannity Show, has over a decade worth of experience in conservative media as a talk radio co-host, and has written articles for multiple national websites which have garnered Drudge Report headlines. And he is also a author himself with his book over there. If any of you are interested in purchasing, he will be over there after he gets through speaking, autographing, and talking to you about his book. So let's welcome Eric.
I'm much less impressive in real life. Thank you. Yeah, as Catherine mentioned, I've worked in local media for some time, and so it's good to see a lot of you again. I've been coming to NEBA meetings for 13 years, which is sort of insane. I'm old enough to remember when NEBA, right, the NE in NEBA stood for Northeast. But of course, I can, thanks Ted. So, but of course, I could see why you'd want to change and remove Northeast from the title of your organization. I mean, who wants to be associated with that much crime anymore, right? So, I mean, between the I think there's a meth lab in Summerbrook a couple years ago, and now you've got car burglaries and shootouts in Killarn. I think if the crime continues on the northeast side of town, I think Brian Deloge is going to have to run for governor. So, that's concerns that I have. But Catherine did mention that, I've worked with Peter Schweizer for a long time, and I've gotten to do a lot of different things as part of working at the Government Accountability Institute. I traveled to Haiti as part of the research for his book, Clinton Cash. We did research into things related to the families of politicians and how they tend to cash in on their families' political connections. And so an opportunity was presented a year ago that they said, well, listen, we did this research. We said, we talk a lot about this idea of voter fraud. And I know it's sort of a controversial topic. And so at GAI, we really are nonpartisan. And we try to go where the facts lead us. And so we said, well, you hear a lot of discussion about voter fraud. President Trump made these claims about millions of votes being illegally cast. And we believe at GAI in the motto of show, don't tell. We want to go where the facts lead us. And so we undertook a national search, the first of its kind look at actual votes that were cast in the 2016 presidential election. So what that means is we went out and gathered as many publicly available voter rolls as we could get. And you can get 21 of them, as it turns out. And we hired a data expert, and we contracted with a commercial database that is used to determine EBT fraud, identity theft, things like that. And what we found, just by looking at those 21 voter rolls that we could get, was quite honestly shocking, because one of the things that you hear about voter fraud, one of the critiques that Donald Trump faced was, well, yeah, maybe voter fraud occurs, but it doesn't occur at a level that could swing a national election. But what we found was that in the state of Florida alone, 2,100 people committed voter fraud through what's known as double voting. Now, it's somewhat intuitive. What it means is that 2,100 people cast a ballot in the state of Florida and then cast a second ballot in a different state. Now, why is the number 2,100 significant? Who remembers 2000 and the presidential election of 2000? What was the margin of victory in 2000? Not 800 plus, but you're close, Ted. It's 537, right? 537. So what that means is we uncovered, just for our first study, nearly 4 times the margin of victory of a presidential election, and that's one example of voter fraud. Now, how does that happen, right? How is it possible that 2,100 people could cast a ballot in this state and cast a second ballot in another state? Well, it turns out quite easily. Nearly 3 million people in this country are actually registered to vote in more than one state. I've done a lot of media. I mean, maybe you're registered to vote in more than one state. I don't know. No judgment on my part. But I did some media, and I was talking to this radio host, and he goes, "Yeah, I used to live in New York, and then I moved to another state, and I didn't tell the government because it's none of their business." And so, I mean, hey, good for you, but you're still registered to vote in more than one state. That's an example of a flaw and a vulnerability in our election system, and that's not the only one. The recent Supreme Court case that just voted on something related to Ohio cited statistics by the Pew Center that found that 24 million voter registrations in this country, that's 1 in 8, are significantly flawed or totally inaccurate. Even Barack Obama's Presidential Commission on Election Administration found that nearly 16 million voter registrations are highly problematic. How do you reconcile everyone admitting to these clear problems with the voter rolls, and yet this dominant narrative that's, well, voter fraud's a myth, it's as common as a lightning strike, it's not really that big of a problem? Here's why. That narrative comes from an organization called the Brennan Center, and you find it cited in almost every news article about voter fraud. Well, there's a couple things to know about the Brennan Center. Number one is they take millions of dollars from a guy named George Soros. The other thing to know is that they define, and this is, by the way, the way that the law works, they define voter fraud in the narrowest possible way. It's an under-inclusive definition. They define it as only an intentional act of impersonation by a non-voter in impersonating a legal voter, right? And so they would say, well, why would some non-citizen, or why would some illegal voter go and pretend to be a legal voter? Well, maybe they wouldn't in a very dominant way. But that's not the only thing that I think you and I would consider to be voter fraud. I think you and I would consider voter fraud to be anything that robs the true weight of an honest vote. And that happens all the time, all over the country. So remember those stats we talked about, and we'll connect some dots here, the stats we talked about in terms of the flaws in our voting registrations. So why does it matter? Well, every flaw in a voting registration, I think, is an opportunity for voter fraud. Here's why. The state of New York, right, they knew they had a problem. They knew there was rampant kind of issues with their voting, so they sent undercover agents into the city of New York to try to vote in 2013 elections, and they voted in non-competitive elections because they knew that their votes, they didn't want them to sway an election one way or another. So they sent these undercover agents, and these people attempted to vote on behalf of people whose names they knew were on the voter rolls, but who shouldn't be legal voters, right? These are people that were dead. These are people that were incarcerated. These are people that no longer lived in this state. And so these 4 undercover agents attempted to cast a total of 63 ballots. 61 of them were successful. And these include a 26-year-old undercover agent casting a ballot on behalf of a deceased woman who would have been 76 years old, right? So it's not like it's a close thing. One of the only 2 examples in which an undercover agent was unsuccessful to cast an illegal ballot occurred because they attempted to cast a ballot on behalf of a convicted felon who was actually incarcerated in the state of New York. And they weren't successful because the felon's mother was actually working at the polling place. So exploiting the flaws is quite simple, and the flaws are everywhere. There are 248 counties in this country that have more registered voters than citizens of legal voting age. So, and that doesn't mean it's some grand conspiracy, but one of my favorite phrases is never confuse incompetence with conspiracy. And so it's just sloppy record keeping, people moving, people not being able to touch base. And so the idea is that we've got massive problems throughout the voting rolls in this country. So why is my book titled How the Left Plans to Steal the Next Election? Because what I found out in my research is that there's a concerted effort on the part of George Soros and Tom Perez, who's the head of the Democratic National Committee right now, to do two things. To number one, prevent any effort to increase voter security, and at the same time, fund groups that then go out and roust up as many voters as possible and funnel them through those same vulnerabilities that the other organizations fight to make sure still exist. And I'll give you a classic example. There's a close election in the state of Ohio recently. You guys remember last month. It's a congressional race that came down to about, I think, 1,000 votes. So the state of Ohio has a Republican Secretary of State. And over the last 4 to 6 years, they've had to fight Soros-funded efforts at every turn to try to make sure their elections and their election rosters were secure. They fought a Soros-funded effort ahead of the 2016 election to block voter ID law. Now, voter ID law is another example of a controversy. You hear a lot of stuff about voter ID. What's the one critique you hear about voter ID? Accessibility is one, but I think racism is the one that you hear quite often. Did you know that there's actually no evidence to support the idea that requiring an ID is somehow oppressive of minority votes? In fact, the state of Georgia, Indiana, and Ohio saw increases in minority turnout after they implemented voter ID. I mean, the reality is, if you want to buy a beer, if you want to get on an airplane, or ironically, if you'd wanted to go to the 2016 Democratic National Convention, you'd have had to show an ID.
Or go to the doctor.
Well, that's between you and your doctor, Ms. Monroe, so, you know, no joke. But yeah, right? The point is you have to show an ID to do a lot of different things. So, but the argument you hear is that, well, requiring an ID is racist. And that was one of the arguments that they made at the Ohio Supreme Court. Well, luckily, the state of Ohio prevailed. Soros also funded an effort to try to block Ohio's attempt to remove ineligible or illegal voters from their voting rolls. Right? Ohio made an effort to say, hey, we want to make sure everybody that's on our voting rolls should be legally casting ballots. Well, again, Mark Elias, who was actually working for the Clinton campaign at the time, filed another lawsuit on behalf of several groups. One of them was called Ohio Organizing Collaborative, to try to block Ohio's efforts to remove these people from the rolls. Well, funny thing, Ohio Organizing Collaborative would later have somebody convicted of registering dead people to vote. So I think it speaks to, like, those are the people that are fighting the legal battle. And then Soros funds groups like Acorn and La Raza, who you don't really hear too much about them anymore, because why? Because they changed their names because of how commonly and chronically they were affiliated with voting fraud, right? Registering people who are illegal and or funneling illegal voters to get out the vote. Now, it's important that we distinguish between people that are actually casting the ballot and these organizations that are going out and rousting up these voters. Because what actually has happened is the vulnerabilities that I think Tom Perez and the Soros-funded organizations have fought to protect actually end up victimizing these very vulnerable populations. In my book, I talk about numerous examples of people that are non-citizens, of felons, and people like of that nature who didn't realize that the law prevents them from trying to vote. It's actually a heartbreaking story. If any of you guys ever get bored, I recommend watching the Florida Channel and watching the Clemency Board meetings. Anybody ever do that for fun? I mean, what are you doing with your life, right? So Michelle does it because Michelle's currently unemployed. So it's yeah, but I recommend doing this because you see stuff like this, and there's actually somebody that works in the Attorney General's office that tipped me off to this. So this lady named Larlene Rami, and she is somebody, she was appealing before the Clemency Board. This is when you've been convicted of a crime, you served time in prison, and you're trying to get your full restoration of rights, which includes the right to vote. And she was speaking to the Clemency Board, which is comprised of the governor, and the Attorney General, and the CFO, and the Ag Commissioner. And she was saying how, hey, like, served time in prison, but I've turned my life around, I've found religion, I'm volunteering, I'm doing all these things. And everyone was quite compelled. They said, well, this looks terrific. But then I believe it was the CFO Atwater said, well, it looks here like you've been voting. And unfortunately, she even had a job with the elections department in South Florida and didn't realize that she shouldn't be voting. So she actually was denied her restoration of rights because the system's so vulnerable that even somebody who works for the elections office doesn't realize that she shouldn't be doing the thing that it was so easy for her to do, and ultimately her request was denied. You guys may have seen a story recently. There's a priest in Illinois who's English, and he's been here since 2006 from England, and he's actually facing deportation. Why do you think? Voting. Everything else is great, but his application to become a naturalized citizen, he checked the box and says, yeah, I've been voting. Well, that's, as his immigration attorney said, is basically a capital offense when it comes to immigration law. Now, what are the requirements, or how difficult is it for a non-citizen to register to vote? It's as simple as when you go to get your driver's license, you check a box that says, I want to register to vote. And in fact, many states now take it a step further and will automatically register you to vote when you have your driver's license renewed. So it's creating this whole system of people who shouldn't vote. Now, some people know this and they flag, and I talk about them in the book as well. People realize, hey, this is, I see that you registered me to vote, I'm actually not a citizen, and I please don't want to be deported, taking me off the list. But those instances are the exception rather than the rule. And so what it does is it creates this target for these groups like Acorn and La Raza that then want to go out, they identify the people on the rolls, and you have these groups that are known as politiqueros in Texas or boleteros in South Florida, and they go out and they basically convince these immigrants to sell their vote. And it's not just immigrants. Elderly populations are quite vulnerable to this as well. It's actually a practice known as granny farming. So, I mean, we all know people who are elderly and are very active and they're registered to vote, but you know, maybe they're not as aware of all the different societal forces at work in the world. So in South Florida, we had a lady named Daisy Cabrera. She was caught with a notebook detailing thousands of transactions between herself and political campaigns in which she was being paid to go out and find elderly people. She'd cultivate a relationship with these elderly people, and she would basically harvest their vote. She would fill out the absentee ballot request form, send it in, and it would be there the day the ballot came back. And it's not only election fraud for us, but it's money for her. Okay. And the reality is that a lot of that is actually legal. And this is why you hear this argument about, well, voter fraud is not a major problem. Well, the illegal voter fraud may not be quite prevalent, but lots of things that I think we would all consider to be voter fraud is quite legal, and it is quite prevalent. Another example of a case where you had political operatives go out and fill out absentee ballot request forms and send them in hundreds of absentee ballot request forms, all with the same signature. The elections office flagged it, said, hey, this looks like a problem, but the law required the elections official to send the ballots back out to the voter. This prompted an investigation by both law enforcement and local media. And the investigation found what they called clear evidence of voter fraud. But what happened? No charges were filed. It was actually former legislator Dave Ehrenberg, who's the state attorney down in South Florida, and he neglected to press charges. Why do you think that is? Well, it was a group of Democrat elected officials, and it happened to be a group of people that had connections to the Haitian community. So he neglected to press charges, again, despite the Broward County Sheriff's Office presenting evidence and an extensive media report in which they found clear evidence of voter fraud. And I think the reality is this, is that Dave Ehrenberg, the state attorney, has further political aspirations. Well, if you're a Democrat and you want to run for office, do you think that your ambitions are furthered by alienating and prosecuting a key voting bloc in your district? No, and that's what happens. So there's both a political angle to it and a practical angle to it. I spoke in St. Louis last month to a group of election law attorneys, and I talked about the book and I talked about the findings. And I had a number of people come up to me afterward and said, yeah, I've actually been a judge and I've actually been a prosecutor. And I declined to prosecute these cases because A, it's not worth the hassle of the headache, it's not worth being called a racist. And B, I have limited resources, so who's my office gonna go after? Somebody committing voter fraud or somebody committing actual physical assault? But the reality is when people do decide to take it seriously, you do see charges filed. The state of Texas has recently seen dozens of convictions because they said, you know what, it's a massive problem and we're going to start doing something about it. So Texas, I think, is starting to be on the forefront of this. North Carolina recently convicted, I think, 19 people of voter fraud because they have actually taken the charge up. So you are seeing organizations start to take this more seriously. And you're also seeing states take it more seriously. The state of West Virginia recently had 100,000 voters removed from their voting rolls. And the Secretary of State, who's a Republican, thanked all the local elections officials for doing this. And he said, I'm glad that we worked together to identify people. They cross-referenced their voter rolls with the Social Security database to find people that were dead, and with the Division of Corrections to find people that were felons. And so they said, okay, let's make sure that everyone off there is removed. And he said, listen, accurate voting rolls are the first step towards ensuring fair and honest elections. And I would just say this. He won his race. Not all secretaries of state are appointed, as we have in Florida. Some of them are elected. West Virginia is one of those states. He beat a woman named Natalie Tennant. So Natalie Tennant, in 2016, who's a Democrat, was part of another source-funded effort known as the Secretary of State Project. Now, what do you think the Secretary of State Project is? It's a group to get Democrats in key elections offices so that you can have as lax oversight and as permissive regulations as possible. And this is documented, we talk about it in the book, but this is like an open secret. So the fact that you got somebody that wasn't part of the Secretary of State Project comes in, identifies 100,000 illegal voters off the voter rolls, I think is significant. So, this is what the landscape looks like. I will tell you that I think you do have to be careful. You'll notice I try to be very precise in the claims that I make. I've had a bit of an experience recently, actually, since the book came out. The election in Ohio was very close, and I wrote an article for a website in which I detailed the backstory about the Ohio Secretary of State fighting to make sure that their election rolls were secure as possible and the voter IDs were implemented. And then I just had a line at the end, and I said, but problems still remain. And I cited some of the voting roll data that we had, in which there was 170 people in the 12th Congressional District that had their birth date listed as either being 1900 or 1800. I don't know if you guys heard anything about this. So, yeah, I was pointing out, hey, listen, there's still problems with the voter rolls. 170 people have a birth date that would make them over 116 years old. Now, the reason for this is because prior to 1974, the state of Ohio didn't require you to have a birth date on your voter registration data. So I just pointed out as another example of a flaw in which some people might choose to take advantage of it. Well, people took that and then immediately turned it into something else. I don't know if you guys have ever had somebody say something that you said, but it wasn't really what you said. That's what happened to me. So I said, hey, 170 people listed in the rolls as being over 116 years old. That turned into Eric Eggers claims 170 dead people voting in Ohio. So I was attacked by BuzzFeed and Huffington Post, and even the Secretary of State of Ohio is coming out and saying, well, these bad actors. And I was like, listen, no, that's not what I said. But it shows you, if you want to have a serious argument about this topic, you need to make sure that we're talking about facts. And that's really what I tried to lay out in the book. But these leftist forces that I document are not the only forces that are currently capable of swaying elections. And I'll just talk briefly about the film that Catherine mentioned that's coming out and it should be available on iTunes. The film is titled The Creepy Line, and it's about how Google and Facebook basically operate as they pretend to be the public library, right? Like you go up to the public library, you say, hey, I'd like to find out more information about this, and they present neutral information. And what we point out in the film is that these are actually private companies with a clear agenda that steer and manipulate the things that we see in unsuspecting ways. Right? I mean, you think about it, like how many people have Netflix? Right? You're only aware of what's on Netflix based on what Netflix shows you, right? I mean, you're like, that looks good to me. And that's basically what happens to us on the internet. So we have a psychologist in the film that's documented evidence of showing the ways in which Google and Facebook are capable of manipulating our own political thoughts and our own electoral preferences. And they found that some people can be manipulated, and you can see a shift in votes of up to 80%. And do you know which political demographic is the most susceptible to being politically manipulated? moderate Republicans. So just something to think about. The film will be out. We've had screenings in New York. We've had screenings in DC. I know that the White House has taken a look at it, and we expect to see some possible action on that level. So with that, I just say thank you very much. And if you guys have any questions on the off chance anybody in here likes to hear themselves speak, I'm happy to answer them. So thank you.
I got a question.
Yeah.
So since you wrote the book on fraud, what would be your way to combat it? What do you suggest that we start to do?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I actually dedicated the book to my grandmother, who's 88 years old, and she's been working as a poll worker in Charleston, South Carolina for 50 years. And because I think because combating voter fraud means having eyes and ears on the ground. The election law attorneys that I spoke with were very receptive, very excited about the book. And I think one of the reasons why it's having positive momentum is because people are saying, hey, finally, we've got documented evidence of what's happened. I spoke to one election law attorney who, he has a signed affidavit about somebody at early voting that saw a 12-year-old vote early in 2012 at a site in Miami. So you've got to have, I think, three things. Number one, you need to have people, I think requiring an ID is not an unnecessary burden, right? Let's make sure the people who are voting are the people who they say they are. The second thing is I think we need to have removal at the state level. Let's make sure the voting rolls are accurate, right? There's no reason when we have a digital era and Amazon knows the last 11 things I bought in the last month. You're telling me we have to settle for having 248 counties with more registered voters than citizens of legal voting age? And I think we need to be also aware of, and I'm going to touch on this, there's a push to have people that aren't American citizens to be able to vote. The head of the DNC is a guy named Tom Perez. And before he worked for the Obama Justice Department, he worked for another group that was like Acorn and La Raza. It's called Casa de Maryland. And Casa de Maryland's big push was to have non-citizen or foreign citizens to have the right to vote. And I say this because there's a move now. For the first time ever, a majority of Democrats believe that people who aren't American citizens believe that illegal immigrants should have the right to vote in American elections. 53% of Democrats, 54% of self-described liberals. It's a Rasmussen poll. So this is the push. I think we need to be aware of this move, right? While on the one hand, you're seeing a call to have ICE abolished, I think the call to have foreign citizens to be able to vote in federal elections is coming. And so we need to be ready for that. Non-citizens are actually already legally allowed to vote in certain local elections. The city of San Francisco has illegal immigrants voting in school board elections. The cities of Chicago and areas in Massachusetts, non-citizens are allowed to vote. So I think we need to be aware of the push that's coming. And then, in order to combat that now, I think you need to be able to have a federal database verification. Let's make sure the people that register to vote are actually citizens. Because the reality is there is not verification of citizenship right now when you register to vote. It's literally as simple as checking a box. I'll be sitting behind that very happy father, signing and selling political propaganda for anybody that's interested. Thank you so much.